it makes everything quite interesting as opposed to just the normal TV bland kind of stuff. So I do have Steve Gilmore on as my guest. This is the second time he's been on the show. The last time was our second Fukushima show. Um, I'll be doing this alone today. Crystal Turner is taking a little bit of a break, which is fine, and we will see her next week. Um, I am planning on going to. I am planning on going to Philadelphia. Mark Passio's band is going to be playing in Philadelphia on the 12th, so I will not be on the next show. Um, I think Trinity has come on and is going to be coming on to help me out, and she's going to be doing the she's going to be going more into neuroscience and the ethics of neuroscience, and a certain researcher by the name, or I shouldn't say researcher, a scientist by the name of Jonathan D. Moreno. Very interesting guy. I will have a show post for that as well, so that we keep all of that stuff ready up and going. Tonight's topic is more like the Draco, morality, different kinds of extraterrestrial species, what's going on in the world today in regards to that, what's going on in maybe the galaxy in regards to that. I think that's a very interesting topic. I spent basically all week looking up the Book of Man on Vimeo by Brian Omley, which is extremely interesting series. And I've been checking out a little bit of Kinnigan's interview on Esoteric Truth Radio with Trinity a little while ago, which is also a very interesting topic. But I didn't get as far into that as I just was absolutely stuck on the Book of Man. I had to keep going. I got maybe almost all the way through it. I haven't seen the last segment yet, but it was extremely interesting. If anybody hasn't checked it out, if you go to the show notes page on www.revisingreality.com, and you check out the first post up there is Revising Reality number 11. And if you go down there, you can find not only you can find Steve's website and links to his book and all that, but you can also find the link to the Book of Man on Vimeo, which is very interesting video series. They're not necessarily large segments, but they're packed with all kinds of interesting stuff, and I'm still scratching my head to figure out how this guy found all this stuff out. Some of it's extremely interesting, and some of it I've never heard before ever. Other things I've heard back and forth, but it's done in such a well conclusive way that I don't know. It was extremely interesting, and I should say that I don't tend to just buy into everything I hear or read. I tend to just think it over and mull it over and try to match it up with other stuff I've heard and try to see what's could be real, what isn't real, and such like that. I even talk about the electric universe an awful lot, and Trinity and I were talking about the other day. And what would I say to people who do not agree with it at all? And I'm not entirely certain because I've just spent so much time researching it that it's hard for me to like. It's just like almost a fact in my mind. And I should try to pay attention to what the opposition says so I can try to debunk their debunking attempts, um, which is fine. I need to get more into that, so I will as time goes on. Um, so without further ado, Steve, how are you doing today? I hear that you're being racked by a big storm, at least somewhat in Australia down there.
Yes, it was actually yesterday. So the storm here has died down, which is good. They've obviously the Draco are on our side. They wanted this to be as smooth as possible. I'll give actually somebody else a plug. I did an interview here in Australia with a group called the Global Freedom Movement, which is run by Brendan Murphy and his partner Amy Devlin. Brendan's written a book called The Grand Illusion. I was given an allocation of 2.5 hours, and we didn't get past question one, and I don't think we actually answered it. so, so that's how deep and convoluted this subject is, and I think really to do it justice, we probably need, I think realistically, 100 hours of airtime, and then we could start to make a little bit of sense of it. So, let's try and squeeze in what we can in this very, very limited segment we've got.
Sounds good. Um, One of my questions for you is
Yep.
I've heard all over the place, and I don't think it's necessarily a lie that there is, the Draco Empire, and that they're not necessarily all that friendly. Is that like, I mean, I know when you talk about the Draco, you don't necessarily make them out that way, and I'm very curious um, how that all ties in.
Well, you have to look at vested interests. And at the moment, what we tend to do, unfortunately, is try and humanize everything. We do that to animals. We do it to plants if we could, except there's no way of doing that. And obviously, inanimate objects, well, they're inanimate objects. So if we look how we look at dogs and cats, they try and dress them in clothes, and dogs' feelings and cats' feelings are human feelings. They've got to be, because that's our empathetic level. Unfortunately, we're dealing with an advanced species or orders of advanced species that we can't empathize with. They are on a completely different wavelength. They have completely different values, completely different mindset to humanity, and this is where the conflict rears up because, of course, some of their values really we would find very very disturbing indeed.
Hmm.
Now, I'll reference my latest post on or article on Exopolitician. I don't know if you put a link up,
I did.
um, but it's about essentially. I can't remember the title, but it's about sacrifice and the great honor of being consumed by a Draco.
That was exactly the title, actually.
And a lot of humans are going to look at that and say, well, where can we? How do we benefit out of that? And you don't. It's just more in terms of understanding genetic heritage and existential purpose, which is something we don't. We simply go through our lives, and this is why our cycle is: we get born and then we mourn at death, and it's all over. Whereas a lot of these other advanced species see beyond death. The life is merely just a stage in a much bigger developmental plan cycle.
Hmm.
Does
It
that
makes
make
sense.
sense?
It does make sense to me to a certain degree. Um, are you saying that necessarily? Are you saying necessarily that there is necessarily not a Draco Empire, or are you just saying that they're not quite so? They're just their motivations are completely different than what we would understand as human beings on this planet with our such limited mindset, which we definitely do have. I mean, we don't really see. A lot of us don't see death as a doorway, which it really technically is. We tend to see
Yes.
death as an end be all end all and try to squeeze all this experience, if you will, up until the very end, instead of just concentrating on living our lives and having fun and learning about and having the experience. We tend to
Yes.
moralize everything and generalize everything and destroy ourselves by moralizing even our own thoughts and actions to the point where we don't even understand what's going on inside of us, let alone outside of the world.
Precisely. Precisely. Yes. You're on tune. You're on tune with this. I think you've got to be careful because Draco is a nickname that we use.
Mm,
It covers a number of different species, if we can call them that, and societies. And in fact, it crosses different dimensional realities. So we have some units, if I can use that term. We have some units of Draco order that are sort of in our reality realms.
mm,
So our reality bandwidth, which is defined by our perception, our conscious perception, is very very limited.
yes,
So we're in the material domains, and that's why the materialists are having a field day at the moment. That's where we are. You shift a bit further down the track. If you imagine, it's like a radio, literally like a radio dial, and you move along the dial, and you find new channels. Well, we're on this, this very immature bandwidth, very very low bandwidth. We move up and then we get into a whole new range of domains where we can do things we can't do here. Like we can't think ourselves to another place.
true. I have heard through
You
multiple
know,
sources that if you're
yes,
astral traveling, you can think to a place, and it's how you travel. Really, actually, like you can travel the other way, but it's very, very cumbersome. So what you do is you imagine the place that you want to go, and then you end up going there. Like it's almost like Robert Monroe described it as almost like stretching yourself, like your astral body out from point A to point B, and then you let go, and it's like an elastic, and it just slingshots you right to where you wanted to go,
Correct,
which
correct.
was very interesting to me.
Correct, except you can do it otherwise. You don't have to do it astrally. So the but there you see in those realms your astral body, as we term it, which is an incorrect term, but we'll call it that because it's something we can adjust to. We it's something we can envisage. Um, uh, in this case, your astral body is your real body. It's physical in every way to you because you're tuned into that domain.
Hmm.
So you think your real body from point A to point B. It doesn't matter where point B is,
Yeah.
and it's an instant bang. You're there. So there's no need for any. You don't actually need to go on spacecrafts at all. In fact, spacecrafts become useful because they contain, equipment that you might need.
Hmm. That makes sense to me.
So
And that would be maybe that would be why that they're so common technically among the spacefaring races.
yes, it's a bit more complex to that because
Oh, I'm
obviously
sure.
if you're going to swap, so their spacecraft can tune into our reality band if they want to, but they can tune out. So that's why you sometimes see. Well, I call them uncategorized um, flying
Flying
objects.
objects, yeah.
I don't call them unidentified. That's an oxymoron. It's uncategorized or UFOs. You can actually see them blinking in and out of existence. That's where they shift reality realms. And
Hmm.
because the way our eyes process light, um, we can't see some of the spectrum. If you actually, they can actually take film and they put it through various filters, and the UFOs then come back into existence because they're in a light in the light spectrum that we can't see. But the light spectrum will pick up other dimensions.
Okay. So that would be like the power
It,
of like a UV filter or
yeah,
whatever. If you can see in the
yes,
UV realm, you can
yes,
see much more.
yes,
There was a
yes,
guy who was able to, I don't remember where his stuff was. I want to find it again, but I'd seen the videos that he had taken, and they were confirmed to be taken of space. He was taking pictures of the moon with his telescope and taking pictures of the different kinds of space vehicles. We want to call them the uncategorized flying objects, etc. And he
yes.
had seen some very interesting things with it because he could see the UV band with his telescope, and he was seeing like things that you shouldn't see, things that shouldn't necessarily be there. Everything was a little bit different. He could actually see inside one of these things, and at first I thought I was looking at like some form of amoeba or something, but it was too rigid, it was too structurized, it was too I don't know how to put it. Like you could actually see like the different
Yes.
levels or floors inside of this spacecraft that was almost in a cylinder type shape. A very strange looking thing, and for a while I'm just looking at him like, what in the world am I looking at? And he observed
Uh,
it for quite some time, and it was moving about, and it was a very interesting thing. But it turns out like he was actually like seeing space. He has like stuff where he's viewed bases on the moon or these structures on the surface, because I understand that the moon, pretty much everything's on the underside, or I should say inside of the moon, as opposed to on the surface. Most of that is just leftovers from an ancient time.
we're getting in, you're getting into realms which is very different to our reality plane. For instance, both Mary Rodwell and Carla Turner, a late Carla Turner, have talked about abductees being able to plug in to living spaceships, which become an extension of their bodies, and it's like you go out into space, and it's like floating in the great ocean. Which is a good metaphor. I talk about that in my book, that space is misunderstood, or actually, it's now becoming to be understood because I'm seeing a number of theories which are saying, well, actually, space is like an ocean. So they're
Yeah,
getting there bit by bit.
I see that the electric universe postulates that a little bit, with the
Yes,
idea of like being able to transmit electricity in space, which would require some form of it has to be teeming with some kind of particles in order to pass this current, especially the massive amount of currents that would require to power a star or power a galaxy, for example. And I actually
Yes.
saw they had kind of done there was a portion of a galaxy map being done, and all of them seemed to
Yes.
flow along these particular lines coming out from one singular direction. So they were coming from somewhere, and all these
Yes.
galaxies were forming along those lines, which was very interesting to me. It seemed like almost like I don't want to put it this way, but I guess I will. The image reminded me of giant wings almost of like what
Oh,
they were figuring out that these galaxies were kind of arranged. And if you watch quasars, they actually seem to come out of galaxies as if they
yes.
are the proto galaxies being born from the other galaxy, from like the parent galaxy. And
Well,
that would
yes,
be a
yes.
very interesting idea.
I discussed this in the book, of course, The Beauty of Existence Decoded, that in fact stars form florets, so they actually spore and they create new rings and rings around rings and rings around rings, and that's how it develops. But I was more talking in terms of they've always talked about space being curved. The reason that is because of our limited reality realm, that all dimensions are in space, but we can only experience our limited bit of it. So that's why space appears curved. If we could, if our reality realm widened, then space would widen for us.
Hmm.
So yes, yes, yes. Where were we? Where was the question before? You asked the question before.
I did. I wanted to know about the Draconian Empire and perhaps like how they what is their ties to this world? Because when looking through the Book of Man, it seems that there was a
Yes,
lot of genetic experiment going on here, and then that was all wiped out, and it was saved, and then
yes.
um,
I,
now see, this is another interesting thing I want to tie into really quick is in the Book of Man, he has encountered information that suggests that mankind, the Tallman, or the original, humans that entered this galaxy, came from somewhere else and decided to emigrate, and then started, setting up colonies, and ended up getting the attention of the Draconian Empire, and there was a war, and they inhabited all kinds of different systems. So some of the things where we go and say, well, this one's Illyrian or this one's that. I mean, there's plenty of different species, but some of these are colonies of quote unquote the Tallman, and they have different names for different tribes of the Tallmen who
yeah.
would have, evolved separately once they got to their separate worlds and have their different colonies. If that makes any sense.
It's a very basic analogy, but it's sort of true. Except he's got to go back a bit further to really. Let's go give you a deep history. I'm going to try and squeeze it into 10 minutes. To give you a sort of what's it, an understanding for dummies. The books for dummies, understanding of a very very deep history, and we've got to go back. And the dates range from 7 to 9 billion years, depending on who talks about this in terms of guesstimation. But I tend to think 7 billion years feels right to me.
Mm,
That we had essentially then that was when the Anunnaki, these mythical Anunnaki appeared, and they're generally known as sort of snake beings. In fact, this isn't entirely true. I think they look more like octopi, and they're sort of like a bit like amoebas, I suppose, but with these tentacles. And they have very very many arms, and they like a sort of sea environment. Then they've never been in the physical sense. So this is in the metaphysical sense. This is the idea of what they'd like to be. And quintessentially, they can be anything at their dimensional level. They can be anything they want, whether physical or metaphysical. The only problem is that until you reach their dimensional status, you can't actually see them. You can't communicate with them because they're out of your bandwidth. So this is the problem. So
okay.
anyway, so at some point in the developmental cycle of the Anunnaki, and what we'll call them the snake form or sea monster form, there was a dispute amongst themselves, if that makes any sense. When have you ever been in two minds about anything?
Oh yes.
And you decide, oh, I'm fed up with that. I used to like broccoli. I've just had too much of it. I'm just fed up with bloody broccoli. I'm going to move to Brussels sprouts. Um, So they got fed up with that design and decided they would take a new face, and that face was the face, our face, and that's why it says in the Bible that man has the face of God. And to a degree, this is true, although in fact the original face looks nothing like any human being I've ever seen. So we've got to take that with a bit of ad lib.
Okay.
So that human face created did actually manifest, and that became the sort of the first manifest realms with these sort of Thor-like superhumans, and I call them version one. I write about these in my unpublished book, The New World Order. So if I make enough book sales of book one, I'll actually publish book two, being crashly commercial. So I talk about these, and these had extraordinary powers, and they really could do things beyond our imagination. But of course, they had also had to some degree our nature, and they caused a lot of problems, and actually shattered. They actually shattered a number of worlds, and they did something to one of the stars, which is very, very bad, which saw their whole solar system collapse, and the fallout landed. Well, actually, partially made ours. It created our solar system.
Hmm.
And this was in the Orion's Belt region or around that area. It was actually a bit farther out from there, but essentially the Orion's Belt became the next phase, or where their next phase ended up, and also the fledgling, our fledgling solar system as well.
Hmm.
Um, these um, these warrior-like human-faced, and well, I say warrior-like, they had a number of other attributes as well, great spirituality, the full thing, but they did have um, this tendency to go to war. And I think it's a human tendency. If we look at our roads today, look at the roads, look how many bloody disputes happen between people just on the roads. We are warlike beings. That's in our nature. That's an inherent thing.
Hmm.
And when you get up to that level, unfortunately, we're not dealing with, we can't give somebody the bird. We're actually more, we move into, we can, sort of blink somebody out of the existence, just with the
Ooh.
blink of an eye. We can use our thoughts to remove somebody from existence. Almost, it's not quite as simple as that, but you can imagine the power of these things.
Yes.
So, because everything essentially stems back to a single being that we call God, who controls the DNA development, and that's a whole separate discussion. But these version one, the humans, were downgraded to version two, and we carried on, and then obviously the old tricks came back into play. The Earth, prior to this timeline incarnation, which started about 1.5 billion years ago, was called Tiamat. So I don't know if you've heard of Tiamat.
Yes.
Okay. Tiamat was destroyed by version 2 human of the human face line, the ones that Onley talks about as these tall beings, the tall man.
Yes.
So that was their version 2, and they then subsequent to that they were downgraded, and there was a version 3 created, using the DNA stem. But after Tiamat was shattered, Earth was rebuilt from the debris.
Okay.
Now that's a whole separate discussion, so I'm having to do this in brief. But as a consequence, they had to create an entirely new timeline. So there's a guy called Sixto Paz Wells. He's actually come out and spoken in Australia But he has got a website, so if you do a Google search for him, he's got a connection with, he doesn't call them Lemurians, but they are Lemurians. And they're located either on or inside a moon off Jupiter called Ganymede. He
Hmm.
again doesn't identify the moon, but that's where they are. They're in a dimensional realm outside our reality belt, but they have a way of tuning into us, or they can, because in subconscious state, we can tune into that dimension, so into their dimension. So I think it's a sort of a bit of the two. But Sixto Paz Wells has actually been taken there on one of their ships. And I think it's difficult to know whether he's in our reality band or their reality band, but I suspect it's in theirs. But he was aware of them in conscious state, so he could see these and connect with these very, very tall men in conscious state. Now, they talk about this, and they talk about the destruction of Tiamat, the creation of the new timeline, and they say that to them, we don't exist. On their reality band, there is no planet Earth.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, enigmatically, in one of the crop circles, which are created by the um, Zeta Reticuli beings, grey beings, I call them Zetas because that's where they originated. I don't think they're actually there now. Where they've gone to, I don't know whether they're actually permanently located, sort of in space on various crafts, but um, they either create or license out the creation of all crop circles on Earth.
Hmm.
And one of the crop circles, enigmatically, that was witnessed, actually showed Earth missing in the planetary alignment, and I think they were
Huh.
referring to that the Earth doesn't actually exist.
Huh. Except not on their timeline, but it does exist
No,
on ours.
well, not timeline, on their dimensional reality.
Hmm. Okay. Very
Having said
interesting.
that, there is a place which a lot of people talk about, which is called Tara, which is the next level of Earth, and then Earth actually expands to about 700 times its size. I'm not sure if it's going to be that big, its current size, but also that the sun will transform. Our current sun is actually a planet. It's a very beautiful, multicolored planet, which will look like a sort of shimmering, multicolored sun when we actually move through that dimensional shift. And that may happen very soon. So it's going to be interesting to see what the establishment, how the establishment deal with it. And I've always maintained that the reason they put up chemtrails, they're doing the chemtrails, is not to pollute the atmosphere, it's to cover up what's going to happen in space.
Yes, and that is very interesting to me. When you said that to me the first time, I was like, "Holy crap!" That is, one of those things you go that screws with your head completely. I
Well,
find that a very fascinating concept. I haven't quite bought into it yet, but I find it extremely fascinating. That whole thing is just blows
well,
my
we
mind every
take
time I think about it.
we take for granted the sky's blue, and the nutty science goes and says, "Oh no, it's just the water molecules reflecting the oceans, and it picks it up in the atmosphere." Well, I say, well, what about over desert regions where there's no oceans? The sky's beautifully blue. How does it pick that up? And it is not blue because it picks up the light refracts. It is because there's something in our atmosphere which alters the way we perceive the cosmos.
Hmm.
One of the things it does is it makes our sun look the way it is. Because if we could see the sun as it really is, we would just see blackness.
Hmm.
And there are some enigmatic photographs that have been leaked out by a satellite that went out to deep space. and where our sun should be is a black hole. Also, there were rumors that one of the astronauts said when they got outside our atmosphere that there was just black. There was no sun. That was
Huh.
one of the things that shocked them.
Yeah. But one of
Now
the many things.
the only way we can check this out is by getting outside their atmosphere, and I wonder why the trip to Mars is only one way. Is it because cat's going to be out of the bag and they're going to say, "Oh shit, there's no sun"? They're right,
That could be very
and in
interesting to
line
find
with.
out.
So I'm giving you all this stuff because I'm just
Yeah.
trying to get your mind around the fact that things are not the way they seem when you get into it. Also, the light of the moon is entirely wrong, and I think there is something that actually generates it on the moon. They've actually David Icke, and all right, David Icke, he's David Icke, and he comes up with a lot of stuff that I don't agree with, but. One of the things he does talk about is a holographic moon. I've always maintained the moon is hollow. It's real. It was hollowed out, but they've got technology in there which does some incredible stuff, and that is part of the illusion that they're creating. That the moonlight is wrong. It is not from the sun. It is something else.
I know I've discussed this movie before, but if the listeners want to check it out, if you go to CRROW777, he's on YouTube, and you can see images of what is termed the lunar wave. And the idea is, I mean, you basically watch this thing and you can see these I want to call them like they almost look like digital interference scan lines, but but if you're actually looking at them in a camera, like he has the camera squared to the moon, well, these digital interference scan lines should, if there was anything on his high powered camera, and it should be like coming up and down. This actually comes on like a sort of a 33rd degree angle to a point. I
Oh
don't think
yeah.
it's quite that, but it's like
Yes.
they come flying across the moon, and usually in a wave of three, and it's almost always around like an eclipse type of thing, or not an eclipse, but one of those solar events, right? And it like
Yes.
it must whatever it is, it must interfere with whatever you see on the moon that gives it its color and its light. It's almost
Yes.
like it's covered by a giant hologram that prevents you
It.
to be able to see the surface of it, and it gives it that light.
Well,
If
this is
if
why
if what you're saying is correct about the sun, you know what I'm saying?
yes, and this is why I'm saying I've always maintained I am extremely skeptical about the moon landing. I believe they took a trip to the moon, but I don't, or maybe several trips to the moon, but I don't think they would ever be given the permission to land because the moon is covered by a holographic dome.
Yes.
Now we're getting into some really weird stuff. You go on the moon and there is an atmosphere which is shared. So let's say you breathe hydrogen. I can go into a room with you and breathe oxygen without any apparatus, and you can breathe hydrogen. The atmosphere converts as it enters your body.
Hmm.
I do not know how the hell they do it, but that is one of the very weird things on the moon.
Just as a
So
side note,
really,
have you ever seen
stuff
anything
that,
about? Oh,
yes,
sorry, I was just gonna say, like, have you ever seen anything about like there was some books in the like a very long time ago that were written that seemed to suggest that somebody had seen these things called like moon elevators of some kind.
yes,
Have you ever heard about
yes.
that?
Yeah, there are all sorts of there are sort of these tramways, these giant tramways, because they used to have these cars that and they were powered by the by ether, by the Ethernet, not Ethernet, by the actually ether, natural electricity, and the cars were just travel all around, and they've still got these glass passageways. Now, apparently, according to I'm not sure he did tell me that they're on the moon, but I believe that that's where they are. There's I call them the Fuji. They're Zeta Draco Cross, and they were essentially the controllers of the very early humans, the Hebrews,
Mm,
and these were the I suppose you'll call them the Yahwehs,
okay.
and they were like little blue. They're blue skin. They got pot bellies. They got no hair. They don't have any genitalia. They or non noticeable. They've got they're vegetarian. They don't have a heart. They've just got very powerful lungs, and they've got a really, really weird gastric system. Um, and they, I think we rebels because they're you know, they're Zetas are very, very logical, very, very spiritual, very fair beings, um, in their own way. Whereas the Draco, of course, are very temperamental. They're very, very huge mood swings. You know, so we're relatively calm compared to them. They've got massive, massive mood swings. So we've got a combination of the two in the Zeta Draco. You can offend humans very easily. We've got very thin skin, and I feel sure that we were offended, and we're very big compared to these little bloody things, and I'm sure that we attacked them and probably killed a few, and so they moved. They moved off planet about 6,000 years ago, 6,500 years ago, and I think they went to the moon, and they now live on the moon, and they come here by portal. There's actually a movie where you can see them coming out. There was in Brazil. You can actually see the light portal in the distance, and there was some young kids being interviewed. It's quite old. It's in the 90s. About a soccer match or something they're playing. You know, a school soccer match, and you can see these bloody little things coming out of the portal, and they're quite weird in the background. So yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah, so
getting back
yes,
to the continuing history,
yeah,
we were at
okay.
you were talking
I, I'm
about.
gonna,
Yeah, keep
I'm
going.
gonna, I'm gonna fast forward it. So, um, otherwise, we're going to run out of time even just going through the history. But essentially, if we go down to go down the destruction of Tiamat, that caused obviously a lot of problems as well. But after the fallout, the initial fallout, there were some beings that on the Anunnaki line, more on their lineage, that settled in the Orion's belt in that region, and they were what we call the Draco today. Um, if I can just go, I suppose if we can just take a step back and talk about the genetic hierarchical order. So
Okay.
we've got us right at the bottom, but right at the top of the Anunnaki that we can never experience because even in our subconscious we don't even get close to their dimensional bandwidth.
Mm.
So they create the Anunnaki via something which was a thought being, which we call Lucifer. That's not his true name, but that's been the name that we've given. That's been used to donate him. Lucifer created beings that are known, a group of beings that are known as Baal. So
Okay.
or Baal, you've seen it in the Bible, all these
Yes.
nasty things, Baal, worship of Baal. In fact, it's not. They're not all nasty. In fact, um, one of the books actually rather lionizes, almost idolizes Baal, and I can't remember which book of the Bible it is. But anyway, so the Baal beings are unique beings in non-manifest form. They cannot reproduce, but they live for an incredibly long time. So if they want to reproduce, it's just simply by genetic manipulation. Baal then created some proto-material beings, which we call dragons. And the dragon dimensional range is massive. So their bandwidth is massive, and it stretches right to the, or used to stretch right to the reality realms. And
Mm.
that's how they could create various. They were geneticists, and they could create various hierarchies using their DNA catalog.
Hmm.
Um, uh, and they created a new order on planet Earth, which we now know as the dinosaurs.
Okay.
Okay, So you can imagine the dinosaurs were reptilian. They look, a lot of them look fairly ferocious. Well, that was their idea of that's what life should look like. And in fact, the very first man, brace yourself, their very first man, as in Superman, was Tyrannosaurus Rex.
Hmm.
Now, what a lot of people don't know, because of course science fudges it, because science wants to humanize it, either humanize everything, but also they want to create animals out of anything that aren't humans. So we can't identify with anything other than animals or these magnificent human beings. So the Tyrannosaurus Rex has been rather what's the word? Rather demoted in status by us.
Okay.
And obviously the archaeologists, or what do they call the guys that study the dinosaurs?
Paleontologists.
Paleontologists. The paleontologists have gone in and they theorized that the T-Rex brain was only, well, it was pretty much the same size of ours, so it wasn't a very bright creature. But in fact, the T-Rex, they don't realize, didn't use the brain in the same way that we do, and it actually had brains in all sorts of parts of its body. They had a whole different system. Um, and the T-Rex, what isn't known, although I must admit I do chuckle that Jurassic Park sort of the movie hinted at it, that T-Rex could communicate telepathically. So they could talk to each other, and it was a natural form of talk. They didn't need to learn any language, because that's what telepathy is. But they also had the ability of telekinesis as well.
Okay. I know that
So
Omni was talking about the rank and file reptilians, where all of them were able to communicate telepathically, so they didn't need to vocalize very often.
yes, correct. He's absolutely spot on. He's spot on. I don't know how he knows that, because he hasn't got that out of any books. I can tell you. So that's a deep secret. So yeah, that is, he's spot on. Absolutely true. Just about all the raptors could do that. And in fact, even the ones that exist today in the caves are sort of versions of raptors. That's what they are. That's what raptors, and they walk a little bit like, they remind me of birds, of ostriches. If you ever see, I think there are two movies on the that I've managed to uncover on the internet, which are very dark because they don't like the light, but they have been filmed, and they walk like ostriches. That's what they walk like. So yeah. So just to go back again. So anyway, the dragons created the dinosaurs. Then there was they settled on the earth. Then the Thor beings, the tall humans, the version 4, I think it was, came and settled on Mars. The Earth at that time was very much closer to the sun. The dragons also had a rest and recreation, but also battalions stationed, or their cosmonauts stationed on a planet called Moldek, which doesn't exist anymore, which was somewhere between Jupiter and Venus, and 100 million years ago, as the Thor being settled on Mars, the Thor humans, they then started to do some searching and looked at Earth, and actually visited Earth and set up a couple of stations. But the atmosphere is very bad, very, how it was a greenhouse planet. It was about where Venus is today, in terms of related to the sun. So it wasn't so much hot because it had a special atmosphere, but it was extraordinarily muggy. So it was dreadful, dreadful. You wouldn't have wanted to live on there as a human. Totally wrong for us. But anyway, they did set something up. The dragons got wind of it. There was a big dispute. They said, "Get off our planet. You're not welcome here." You can just imagine how it went. So there was friction between those two orders, and eventually that ended up with a giant war. And the version 2 did their old tricks. Sorry, version 4 human. They went and shattered Moldek, and the fallout obviously ended up. That was a meteorite shower that eventually wiped out the dinosaurs. It also shunted Earth out of position. It actually, I felt, collided with, or appeared to sort of seem like collide with Mars, and Mars was about where we were. So Mars actually acted as a brake, and we then dropped into that orbit cycle, and Mars was shunted out to where it was. And I hear you say that the electric universe people have sort of corroborated that in some way.
Yes. Electric universe talks about, like, so if you have, it's the same concept. If you have two separately charged bodies, one of them positive, one of them negative, if you bring them together, there's a spark. Like if you just, smart enough, I mean stupid enough to take, two different like a screwdrivers and like short out an electrical socket, well, there's a giant spark. So imagine if you got two giant planetary bodies to damn near collide, you would have a massive thunderbolt between the two, and one of them would probably get the brunt of the impact, and it would shunt the two planets apart to try to
Right.
prevent. It's almost like a built-in mechanic to try to prevent planets from
Yes.
actually destroying each other in total collision.
Yes.
Now, if
Yes.
planets were of closer charge to one another, there wouldn't be as big of a spark, and there could have, with enough force and enough, momentum, you could probably break that mechanic and actually shatter the thing. So that is
Yes.
something to be aware of. And yes, that's been talked about. And if you look up Emmanuel Velikovsky's book, Worlds in Collision, he was much maligned for that, but he did a whole book on the idea that the solar system had looked nothing like it does today.
Yes.
I think he came out with that in the 70s. Very interesting
Yes.
guy. Like I said, the scientific community completely, they hated him. They tried to
I'm
shut him
not
down. They
surprised.
didn't want anything to do with him. And the
Yes.
electric universe people have kind of taken his work and like put a lot of scientific theory and scientific fact behind it to show that maybe this was actually possible, and what are the mechanics of collisions. And that's one of the
Yes.
reasons why meteors, when they hit the atmosphere, are so bright. They're not just bright because they're burning up, they're bright because they're a negatively charged body entering the positively charged body's atmosphere, and they're
Yes.
interacting electrically with the Earth as they come down. And that is also why they're usually so small by the time they end up like colliding in theory with the Earth. Is
Yes.
what happens is
Yes.
like they get close enough, and there's almost like an electrical charge between the two, and it would sublimate
Yes.
the actual projectile into the crust of the planet that it was hit. So
Yes.
very interesting.
Yeah, well, just to add to that, there are a number of ancient texts which talks of planets colliding, particularly in relation to Earth, and also there's a big dent. Apparently, I think I vaguely recall that science hasn't managed to explain in the Earth, some ancient event which created a big dent in the Earth, and so that seems to satisfy the information that I've received through cosmic sources.
Mm.
So anyway, so that was the end of the dinosaurs. Uh, Good old man was downgraded to version 5, of course, um, and would only be downgraded once more before we became Atlantis man. But so anyway, part of the deal, obviously, man was very upset. The tall human was very, very remorseful of what of his actions, and so he gave the DNA catalog to the dragons. That was part of the reparations, part of the payment. So the dragons didn't just have their own DNA set; they also had the highly prized DNA set of man. So the dragons then got to work, and firstly they tried to recreate the pterodactyl, and fuse that with the human gene, or the what preceded humanity, the human gene set. I'll call them humans. They're not really humans, but so the human gene set, and created pteroids, the
Mm.
beings known as pteroids, and these are very ancient. They date back to, I think it was done about 50 million years ago. It was pretty much when just after the dinosaurs died out, and that became their new man. And that they're now located in the fifth dimension, so they're well away from us. And they're very canine, and they look sort of between bats and dogs, I suppose. They're very, very strange looking beings, and they have all sorts of different varieties. Um, they remind me of the sort of Dracula tales, that sort of creature. That's the sort of thing that they are. They're Mothman. If you've heard of the Mothman tales, they're bashing around the internet. They're very much the terror pteroid sort of, that's the pteroid style being. Um, and then later, a long time later, somewhere between 3 and 5 million years ago, the pteroids, in conjunction perhaps with the dragons, created the um, Siacars, which were made from human and um, tyrannosaur DNA.
Okay.
So are you still with me? So
Oh yes.
the Draco umbrella incorporates those two rather than the dragons or the Dracon as they're known in more ancient times. And that's actually a word that's more ancient than the Greek. The Greek word for dragon is Dracon, you know, obviously the Draco is a variant, you know,
Yes.
of Dracon, because what's the Greek, the Latin, is it Draconis or something like that?
Yeah.
Um, uh, um, I did use those words in my latest Exopolitician post, but I've forgotten them already. But anyway, so you can see where the stem comes from. So
Yes.
the Draco beings are branched into um, the pteroids and the Siacars. Now, the pteroids, ironically, are mammalian. So Neanderthal, I think, was their first.
Oh,
Ah,
we're gonna have to break here for a minute, so
yeah,
we'll just continue with this and the pteroids as soon as we get back.
fantastic.
Welcome back, everyone. Steve and I are back on here. We've been covering some very interesting things. We were just talking about pteroids, which is a rather interesting um, idea, a very interesting being that he was saying it looks between like a dog and a bat, which is fascinating to me as well. Um, and in case you're just joining us now, we've been talking about all kinds of different ancient history as far as like the Dracos and the humans are involved in our solar system and all kinds of interesting topics that go in between there. We were even talking about perhaps almost like cable cars to the moon, for lack of a better term. Steve, how are you doing again?
I'm doing very good. I've got a cup of coffee beside me, so I'm pepped up, ready to go.
All right. So I guess we should get back to the pteroids and their development.
So we talked about the creation of Siakar, which are the reptilian man, being human. It's actually mostly human, comparatively, and Tyrannosaur DNA. Um, Now, the pteroids are their genetic superiors, and as I've said, I believe that in conjunction with the dragons, that it was a joint venture effort that created the Siacars.
Hmm.
Um, and these are the ones, by the way, that are generally involved with reptilian, you know, in the abductions. You know, they're doing the dreadful things, but they're not all dreadful. So again, that's quite a complex subject, which I'm sure we're going to get onto at some point.
Yeah.
Um, Now, the the pteroids created. They're more of a mammal. They're the mammalian line, so their physical, as in right in our realm, man was Neanderthal. So they created Homo erectus. So Neanderthal was their Adam. So I actually have written I'm in the process of writing book 3 of 11, which is going to be titled "The Birth of Humanity," and I decode that enigmatic. Um, it's called a parable, but it's not a parable, of Genesis, the Adam and Eve, and the fall of grace. And in fact, it's all there. You've just got to know how to interpret what's been written. So the truth is there. The problem is it's just misinterpreted to buggery, so nobody understands it, and it's treated in a very poor way. So Adam represents Neanderthal, Um, Eve wasn't a man, by the way. It was a woman. It was man, and that's human. That's us. So,
Okay.
that's the positioning. And if you take the texts in that way, if you look at the text, everything makes perfect sense.
Okay, I've
Um,
seen Michael Tsarion kind of said the same thing actually. I
yes,
think it was him. Like in his research, he was saying that the if you interpret the myth in the Bible, the like especially Genesis, then you can see that there was two different distinct lines, and they were trying to survive for one, but there was these two different distinct lines of beings, and one of them ended up being us.
yes. Actually, all the different tribes were actually gene sets, and this is why, because the Zionists really want a unified world. They pushed the one race bullshit. They're behind it.
Mm,
There aren't one race. Alex Collier, amongst a number of others, have said, he's identified 26 genetic types within the human genome. And the human genome is poor science, by the way. They do not understand genetics yet. But even so, the indicators are there.
mm.
So going back, I'll give them the cat's out of the bag now. I've already released it. I've already told you that the Territes created mammalian man. Um, this actually it was the Seercars that created Eve or us. So isn't that irony? That nasty snake in the text, the serpent was actually the creators of of us. That was symbolising the Seercar and their geneticists, and they've got their own teams, by the way, and they love to create different hybrid types. And we were their creation, but we were unauthorized, um, and that caused a lot of problems. That's caused
Okay.
a lot of problems. So we were creating it, and the evidence is there in Genesis, and that's why God was angry. Um, Again, we can debate all the day as long as to who God was. Again, I think that's referring to the Anunnaki, but the Anunnaki had drafted in the Lemurians, who've been here had been here for a fairly long time, in fact 750,000 years, I think, more or less, on the
Mm,
surface. Um, and they were their keepers on Earth. So
okay.
that's your basic history. Now, um, where the interest comes, as far as I'm concerned, is that in terms of the hierarchy, we've gone from Anunnaki down to Lucifer, down to Baal, down to the dragons, down to the Territes, down to the Seercars, down to us. Um, there is another branch here. So we've got version 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Version 6 was Atlantis Man. Version 7 was us. So we've got the two lines converging. One line is the Thor tall men that Onley talks about, and the other line is right the way up to the sea monster Anunnaki, and
Okay.
that's our heritage. So we were the first joint venture. We were the first coming together of that gene set, because really it split right at the start from the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki split into the face of God, that human, and so really we're actually seeing a convergence of the two lines, which should be a wonderful thing. But unfortunately, it's not worked out that way.
Okay. Actually, Omni did kind of bring that in. I got to struggle to remember that part, but there was settlements of the other men on the planet, and then they had ended up the two lines come together because the reptilians, or as you were saying, the Sia card created the one man, and then the other man was also there, and there was also like a third one because that was the Neanderthal round, and then ended up like
Yeah,
the two major lines, which one of them could be called the I'm trying to think of how he put it. It was the Duman. It was like DH, and then it was apostrophe, and then it was MAN, and that was kind of like the original
all right,
people, and
okay,
then
yeah.
like the original Siakar creation, and then the
He
Tallmen came down, and then they actually like ended up interbreeding after a while because there was all these
Yes.
catastrophes. and then
Yeah,
they end up just getting stuck.
he's right on the money there. I try to keep it simple. There is something that was created that was not Neanderthal and was not what we call human. So it was between the two. It was this sort of hairy human, and I think that's what he's talking about with the do man. So there was a phase between, and in fact, it gets more complex because the Siakars created their own version of Neanderthal as well. So it's very complex, but I tried to keep it really simple. You know, this was a model for dummies, so we can really come to terms with it. I think it's fairly obvious where the track is.
Yeah.
We can talk a bit further in terms about the creation, and I can give you where the Zetas fit in with us,
So
because you've got these Zeta beings hovering around creating the crop circles and saying, well, the grey beings fit into all this, and the grey beings actually created our planet. They were the ones that built Earth.
so this is a question now. Is
Yes,
the how do I put this? What did he call them? Like the Zetas, are they um called, or they can they be called the doll? Is that was the term I think he used, was the doll. Um like I think that's DHAL or something like that, close to that. Is that the same
yes,
species?
perhaps. So they were they grey with
Yes, that's how he described them.
the
Yes, but
black
they
eyes.
yes.
All right, well, they're probably the ones, although there are
Okay.
billions of different varieties of them. They've
That
got
that
the
makes sense too.
whole, they've got all their different horizons. And then we can go back prior to Big Bang, and there was a Big Bang, but it wasn't the beginning, it was the end. So the, the God, which is the unique, the single being, which is the combination of everything, has a kill switch facility, so he can wipe everything out. So if things get too bad, the equilibrium of the of everything gets too bad, he just kills it. He, she, it kills it. And the Big Bang event was a kill switch event. However, so prior to that, man was an ant being. Actually, there were man used to the very earliest man was a tree, and these trees could walk. And it's
Huh.
ironic that there's a legend out there somewhere which talks about man being made of wood. So it's incredible. All the stuff is there. It's just you've got to know how to interpret it. So this man made of wood stretches back bloody before everything existed now. So the being that actually wasn't wiped out by Big Bang. So there was one being that survived, and it was the mantis gene set, or the
Never heard of
mantids as
them.
they're known. These are like giant grasshoppers, and they're renowned for their wisdom because they stretch back prior to our existence. And I don't just talk about because our timeline's only going for 1.5 billion years, but I'm talking about the existence of everything within the potential reality band we could face.
Hmm.
So
I track that.
the mantis have been the brokers between the Zetas and the Draco. And a guy called Simon Parks hints at this because he's had a relationship with the mantis beings, and he's been on their spaceship, and they've confirmed they've got a joint venture relationship with the Draco. A lady called Susie Hanson has written a book where she confirms that the Zetas have a relationship um, with the mantis beings, though
Okay.
she doesn't confirm that they have a direct relationship with the Draco, even though that just about every important spokesman on the behalf of Zetas is an absolute full-blood reptilian. And they don't realize it. They think they're Zetas, but they're all reptilians because
Hmm.
I can see the energy body and they're very strong. Now, talking about that, a number of people obviously shy away from the fact, they say, well, no, we're not reptilians, we're humans. The giveaway in terms of our physicality is our limbic system, our pulmonary system, which is fused cold and warm blood. The
Hmm.
actual seer cars have a dual pulmonary system, and they can, using their minds at will, they can convert to warm-blooded or cold-blooded, but they prefer cold-blooded.
Okay.
Now, we, using will, can will on adrenaline, using the limbic system. We're junkies. We're natural drunkies.
Hmm.
You go without food for a very long period of time, your body will just say, your brain will say, no, no, I need something to some pep juice, and you're going to be overdrive.
Yeah.
You're going to be
I
speeding off
noticed.
your nut.
I noticed that like if I don't eat for a while and I start to feel my
Yes,
blood sugar getting low, I really have to eat.
yes.
Like I have this switch, and I know that when it hits, I have to eat. Like I don't have a choice. I got to eat, otherwise I'm gonna either pass out eventually. You know what I mean?
Why? Why do you think the religious moguls all fast? Why do you think they have Ramadan and they go through these incredible experiences in Ramadan deliberately? A lot of the guys that say, "Oh, how to plug into the other side," you don't need drugs. You go without food and you go through these meditation exercises.
Hmm.
You key in the natural bug drugs that the body peps in with your mind, and that takes you over to your subconscious. Your subconscious kicks in even though you don't realize it.
Okay. I
Now,
mean,
with me,
does that does that?
I'm a very strange human being. Is I can do that without all that. I am
Hmm.
connected 24/7.
So does that connect into like say sleep deprivation?
I have problems. I get very bad headaches sometimes.
Hmm.
So because I'm being bombarded, I think they know that I'm the correct voice, and there are you can imagine. Let's just say they've only got one representative. Let's say you've got 1,000 species out there that want me to be their voice. Well, they're all trying to get in all at the same time, and I haven't got enough life to fit them all in. And that's
Hmm.
only one for each, they've not just, they used to bombard my brainstem. So they come in by the back door because that's how I go out. But now they do both ends. So I've got my pituitary gland, or just around the your crown at your forehead. There's the just there. There's this apple inside, and they bombard that, and they bombard the front door and the back door now. So they really are trying to get the message out.
Hmm. Very interesting.
Yes, yes, yes,
So if we move so if we move into the current times, what exactly is
yes.
going on as far as so we've got these people that are seem to be trying to attempt to steer world affairs in one direction or another, and their connection in theory to the Draco or to the higher echelons of some of the Draco anyway. Like, how does all of this tie into now? I mean, is that a good direction to take this in at this point?
I think so. I think we have to understand the false matrix, and we have to understand how it's used. So there's going to be another history lesson. The false matrix was meant to have been set up about 550 million years ago, and this is leveraging some very, very large crystals which act as struts inside our planet. And our planet, the guys that believe our planet is hollow are partially correct. Yes, there are other layers, and yes, there are beings inside the planet, and yes, there is a volcanic layer which is caused by an inner sort of sun, um, and in some of the layers you can't see the sun. So, but there is an inner light source, and that creates the plasma, which obviously erupts occasionally in volcanoes. So, but these giant crystals form an etheric um, network um, around the planet, and uh, that has been leveraged by the Draco in more recent times. So
Hmm.
it's been converted for their purposes. And what they use it for is to monitor every single human thought. It's mind boggling how the hell they do it, but they monitor every single thought.
So, what do they do with all that information?
Oh well, they obviously they don't. It's like it's just a monitoring system, and they have
Hmm.
ways of highlighting. and they can intervene where necessary. So they're only interested in they have these coding systems which are very complex, and they can pick it up, and they would be monitoring me 24/7 because I'm a very, as far as they're concerned, a very vital individual. I'm a very vital part of it.
Hmm.
Now, there is also a way where they can influence, put words into certain people's mouths. And
Okay.
so some of the conspiracy theories where they're talking about politicians being actually taken over by reptilian entities may be onto something.
I've seen some videos where it looks highly suspicious, like there's a hologram being protected over an individual, and then it kind of fails, and you can actually see through them, and sometimes it looks very reptilian behind the face. I mean, is that
Well,
a real thing?
yeah, that's a bit. That's a bit. That's a different thing that's happening there. In fact, you could look at videos of anybody and you would see that. So, because we DNA, our manifest form, we're actually made of light. That's what we're made of. Whether we like it or not, if you drill down, you look at atoms. Atoms are made of light. That's what we're made of. We're made of light. We rationalize that light in physical form, but quintessentially, the light just blinks in and out. So it's a static environment. And at certain times, depending on our emotional state, we will trigger different aspects of our DNA. And we may bring out our seer car if the mood calls for that. So and it'll be sort of very split second, and almost sort of trick of the light stuff. So
Okay.
if you go through a film of anybody, you can essentially see. I actually had an acquaintance once who had literally done that. He'd been filming people, and he would find how they would change. He would literally scroll through, and he'd say, "Oh no, well, can you see that?" And oh no, but no, it's only a trick of the light. We call it a trick of the light, but actually, it's something more than that.
So I've seen a video where it was very obvious. And it didn't quite look like, just some kind of an error in the film, or you know what I mean. It was a YouTube video, but it was very, very strange. It was of this rabbi, and he seemed to have a completely different head than what he should
Yeah.
have had, like every now and again, and it was
Yes.
extremely jarring and very, very strange looking. Like, I mean, I've never seen
Yes.
anything quite like that personally.
Oh,
I was
there are a number of them. There are a number of them, and obviously some people display it more than others. That may be evidence, as you say, of 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 some kind of intervention, but not necessarily.
hmm,
I think that the intervention is you can tell when interventions happen by the way that they behave. So the seer cars in their world have a very different view of honor.
okay,
Very different view of honor. They've got a very different view of, for instance, uh, what's acceptable in terms of payback to
hmm,
us. So their morality is very eye for eye.
okay. So they might be
So if
screwing
you
with somebody because they don't like what they're doing.
right,
Okay.
so it's they're very much more, um, in some ways, very much more vindictive than us, miles more vindictive. In other ways, they're much more are much easier to negotiate with because there are areas, and you know my passionate topics. There are areas we just switch off. I can't. There are some subjects I cannot discuss with, have a meaningful discussion with, because they've so determined they're right on it that we can't delve into the detail.
Okay.
I'm thinking, I'll give you top pedophilia. How can you have a
Hmm.
meaningful conversation about that with anybody? So we have these. The human mindset is very set in its own special way.
Yes, very true. I did have
So
something to bring up about the Anukai because I wanted to say this, and
yes,
I didn't want to interrupt you when you were talking about it.
no, no,
But
sure,
as soon
sure,
as you said that they were like almost like octopus or whatever, I just
yes,
immediately thought of Cthulhu. I don't know how you really pronounce that term.
Cthulhu.
Talk about like yeah, like Lovecraft, and he talks about the Cthulhu, and how they were whatever they were. Um, I thought that was
Very,
absolutely
very,
fascinating.
very perceptive of you. And in fact, I mentioned Lovecraft because Lovecraft is on it, and even I was right on the money. So even though he wrote fiction, it wasn't.
Mm.
So Cthulhu is about what you're looking at.
Oh, I
He's
did
talking
have.
about the Anunnaki.
Okay. I did have another thing too. Whenever you were talking about like sea monster, and you were equating to you're
Yeah.
equating them to like sea monsters. So I was reading the guy who does the shaman type stuff. And he was the warrior shaman. I can't remember his name now off the top of my head, and I don't know why. Because I really liked his stuff. Warrior shaman. What I'm talking about though. Uh, he was talking about experiences like on the other realms through ayahuasca, and he was in the
Oh
jungle
yes.
with the shamans, and they were showing him things, um, and he was going through this experience, and they had to pull him out. But what he was seeing was like these giant beings that came from space and ended up looking like some sort of reptilian, but they were huge and they were also like sea monsters, like whales, like just massive things.
Yes.
And they were coming and they were actually like communicating to him as he was doing this, and they was scary and terrifying to him. And they ended up the shaman had to help him like come back to reality. Um, I
Right.
thought maybe that kind of tied in when you said that. It made a lot of sense to me. It was just like, oh, that could have been what he saw because he was terrified, literally terrified. They were like saying things like "We made you," you know what I mean? Like we could take you out, you know what I mean? Like that kind of stuff.
Well, I can tell you this: that Enki actually looks. I can see Enki. He doesn't. This form doesn't exist anymore, which is really weird. They wiped it out, and I don't know why. I still haven't got. Enki exists, but the form doesn't. They wiped it out. I don't know why. It looks like a giant alligator
Mm.
with a very strange body, massive, but the eye is so sharp, so intelligent. You know when you see somebody with intelligent eyes.
Yeah.
Have you seen that? You can see, oh, this guy's a real brain box. You just look at the eyes. You just
Yeah.
know.
Yes.
Well, this is 100 times more intelligent than that. You know, you're saying, wow, my God. And this is on this. It's like he can see everything all around you. You know, he's everywhere. He's not going to miss a trick.
Yes.
Now, of course, they talk in the ancient texts. It talks about these dreadful ceremonies that they went through, where they sacrificed people and gave them up. Certainly, in terms of Baal, they offered. Usually, actually, was I think it was in the Bible. They talk about the firstborn
Okay.
and God in that sense was because Abraham had a deal, but God in that sense was Baal because it all makes sense. So um, what the reptilians would do is, in order to connect with their heritage, and obviously Baal is very special because it's really the manifest form of the Anunnaki. So you're actually meeting with God, God, it, he, she, or itself. Um, and so they would go through these exercises to try and entice Baal to manifest before them. And that would be it was a sort of sexual, because in these realms, for instance, sexual activity gives off like a red smoke, I describe. So in the fifth dimension, it will give off a red smoke. That's what
Okay.
sex looks like, providing it's real, providing it's really real. You know, it's not contrived. Providing it's full of the right, correct energy, it will give off a correct smoke, a red smoke. And then there's the sacrifice when the in the death state. Actually, it's not alive. So what they do is they get people, the victim, into zombie state. So it would still be alive but dead at the same time. You know, dead to the world but alive. You know, a zombie state. And then that would be given to Baal to consume. um, and that also gave Baal a pinpoint. You know, it had a cross reference where to actually align and manifest. So yeah, so that explains that. But that's I don't didn't want to dwell on the negative side because they see that as a very highly spiritual. You know, as I say, the greatest honor. Why would Baal want to consume a lesser being? Because all as far as Baal is concerned, it's infusing something that's going to be part of it. So it doesn't want to infuse with crap. It wants to infuse with the very best stuff. Um, and the Draco have a similar philosophy. So when it talks about them, you know, being consumed by a Draco, and I'm not sure if they even actually eat the flesh, um, but they would target someone or some entity that they felt was a, 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 a big plus to um, their whole psyche because they're actually sharing the same existence. Does that make
So
sense?
yes, it does. What would happen to the person or thing that was consumed?
Well, they would just become part of it.
Hmm.
Now, obviously, it's not very nice for because you lose your individuality.
Yes, I don't like that very much. Maybe I shouldn't
Right,
be
right,
so
precisely.
exemplary. Maybe I should not strive to be such an exemplary person then, because I could get consumed. I don't know if I like that idea. Oh, I was thinking of Carlos Castaneda. I was reading his book. That's where I remember
Right.
reading that in. I was reading in
Yes.
Carlos Castaneda when he was talking about that. That was
Yes.
where, that guy had seen these things. Um, I think it was in Teachings of Don Juan, but I'm not sure if that was the particular book that I was perusing when I saw that, when I was reading that account of seeing these things. So
Yeah.
we did kind of get off track here. So let's
So
go. We do want to
false
look
matrix.
into
So the
yeah.
matrix was set up, and I think the Zetas would have been involved with that 550 million years ago. There were some humanoid beings on the planet at that stage, but I think they were etheric. We might call them the Elohim light beings. They were very much, you know, they were sort of out of it.
Mm,
So um, the um, we move forward a massive amount of time, and we come to the creation of humanity was about 125,000 years ago. That's when we were created.
okay.
Our gene stock is obviously goes back to the dawn of time, but we as entities were created then. Um, the Anunnaki were very displeased, and there was a big war 120,000 years ago, and we were moved off planet just in the nick of time, to Mars, and we were holed up on Mars, and then we came back at the end of the war. Um, uh, Oh no, we didn't come back at the end of the war. The war finished about 102,000 years ago, and it resulted. There were used to be three moons that used to orbit the Earth. We're now down to one, and some question whether that's real. But on one of the moons, it had a very long orbit. It was quite a long way out from the Earth.
Uh-huh.
Um, who the troublemakers had basically landed on there and were using it as a base. The moon got smashed, and that got rid of the troublemakers. But there was no moon after that. And so, moving on, um, the next incident was. The Anunnaki had come onto Earth about 450,000 years ago. And you can see this in the Sumerian myths of Inanna, where they try and conquer the underworld. It was in fact when they took on they tried to basically take on take the underworld away from the Draco, because that's the Draco realms. That's where the Seercars were, and the Seercars had built up some very good defenses, and the Anunnaki failed. They failed to penetrate. So they decided never to go back there. But they were on the surface, and they stopped so the Draco wouldn't go on the surface because the Anunnaki were too strong.
Mm.
on the planet's surface. So there was that equilibrium. I'm giving you the very short, the very brief version. We can go into a lot of detail, and I'll give you an entirely different picture. But I'm giving you the brief version.
Yeah.
So anyway, so that equilibrium. The Draco were inner Earth, reptilians were inner Earth at that stage, and on the Earth were from about pretty much all the way through the Lemurians were on the Earth, but they didn't set up their great civilizations until about 70,000 years ago. I didn't really set anything up. It was much more of a sort of nomadic existence, as far as I can gather.
Mm.
Um, and Lemuria was set up about, as I say, about 70,000 years ago, and there was a disaster on the moon where a comet, sorry, a disaster on Mars where a comet came down, and the guys that took us off, these were the Atlanteans, took us off, rescued us from the Anunnaki, took us off planet, had miscalculated the event, and it wiped 90% of the atmosphere off Mars, and they were forced to come back to the Earth. And that was about 35,000 years ago. So it was a mass exodus back to Earth of humanity, us. And it's ironic that, in fact, this is sort of validated by paleontology, because they find that that's when the great bulk of the earliest skeletons start to appear on Earth. The earliest human skeletons was about sort of 35,000 years ago, something like that. Now, I jumped forward, and I didn't explain. Sorry, one of the things I said back before, I didn't explain very well. We were taken off planet by version 6 human. So just before the giant, the cosmic war 120,000 years ago, we were rescued by version 6 humans who were the keepers of Atlantis. So that's the connection. That's a very important connection. We were then brought back by the same Atlantis group of beings to 35,000 years ago. Atlantis, though, wasn't set up really as it's been projected in the myths until after the Lemurians left, and the Lemurians were almost wiped out on the planet's surface by another comet disaster that happened 24,000 years ago and created those two great big trenches in the Pacific Ocean. So those two deep spots were created by a massive comet, and they tried to because they obviously learnt from Mars, they tried to stop it with a traction beam, but they fumbled it, and the bloody thing split in two, and that's why it created the two trenches. But it decimated Lemuria, which would have been what we call the Pacific Ocean today. That was their core. That was their core center. So it was really around the sort of equatorial region of Earth, not around the center band of Earth. That's where they seem to like to live. The great heartland of Atlantis, the famous Atlantis technology city, was under what we now call the Arctic Circle.
Ah.
And the Arctic Circle was not created by a supposed massive ice age. That's science bullshit. The Arctic Circle was created by the moon Fala, which was a tiny ice moon that used to revolve the Earth apparently 9 days, each 9 days according to the Vedas.
Okay.
Due to a dispute again with the Greys, which were holed up there, they shot it out of the sky, but at that time it was the orbit of this planet this moon was very close to the Earth at one point. Very close. It was almost like the metaphor was you could almost put your hand out and touch it. It seemed that close. And that point happened to be just over their technology city, and I'm presuming they set it up deliberately because of that. But so they shot it out of the sky, and of course, what happened? It came bang down and wiped out. It was only a few seconds it took, and it wiped out the technology city, flattened it, and it apparently, according to Graham Hancock, froze the whole of the northern hemisphere for about 2,000 years,
Hmm.
and then it started to thaw out gradually. So, so the putting the clock back, the Lemurians were wiped out 24,000 years ago. Shall we say about 22,000, 20 to 22,000 BC? I'll give it a bit of latitude on dates. At that point, the Drake, oh, and prior to that, 35,000 years ago, the Anunnaki had left, and that's why it was safe for the guys from Atlantis to come back to Earth. The version 6 human on Atlantis had a big fallout with the Anunnaki of 450,000 years ago, which is a whole new story. We haven't got time to go through that today, but so anyway, so the Atlantis, the Lemurians have gone. The about 20,000 years ago, the Draco had got wind. It was a rather much more safe. The Seacars had got wind. It was much more safe on the planet's surface, and they started to investigate. And by 16,000, well, 16,000 to 17,000 BC, they created a joint venture technology city with the keepers of Atlantis.
Hmm.
That joint venture city lasted for about a relationship lasted for about 3,000 or 4,000 years, and they actually shot the ice moon fell out of the sky 12,800 BC in that century of 12,800 BC. I haven't got an exact date.
Okay.
The knock-on effect of that. Um, 10,583 BC, the Earth's core dislodged from the center, and it slipped. I don't think it slipped a full revolution, but it slipped a long way. And again, it was a matter of seconds. So the surface was shook like a paperweight. And I think this is what the Great Floods are referring to in the in some of the ancient texts. That I suspect we were wiped out, and they had to restock. So they've actually got stock of all our genetic stock off planet, so they can restock at any point. But I think that they will have restocked after that, but I don't know. Maybe some survived. It was a massive event. So moving on, then the after that, the Draco, of course, were nicely tucked up inside. Well, the people from Atlantis were gone, so the Draco came back out about 10,000 BC, and that's when they started to interfere with us, and they adapted the matrix that had been created at 550,000 years ago to monitor our thoughts, but they also did other things where they tried to intervene with the development of our DNA.
Okay. So bringing all this together into the now, since we
Yes.
have about probably about 12 minutes or so left. I mean,
Yes.
unfortunately, it's such a short time.
Yes. I thought it was going to be a struggle.
It is, but it's fun. I mean, we'll just have to have you
Yes.
on again, like after not the 12th, because obviously I can't be
Yes.
here. But um, so tying that all into the now, when we look
Yes.
at the now political structure of the human race at this point and how we treat each other and all this other stuff, like what exactly is going on with that? I mean, how much power did the Draco have with the human hierarchy, and what exactly are the plans? Why are things as bad as they are now? In
Just to
terms of all
correct you
this.
on that, just to correct you on that point, there is no human race. humans are all hybrids, and
Well,
are of all different types. So if you're going to use, be correct, it's
okay.
races, and there are numerous races,
Yes.
human races, but we're all very closely tuned to each other, and deliberately so.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, what was the question again? I've forgotten.
Yeah, I don't argue with that. I just usually term humans just as us, just because it's
Okay,
easy.
yeah, sure,
Um,
sure.
because I do. It's not lost on me that we are hybrids in any sense of the word. But
You want
so what is going on like
what's
now with the
yeah,
current power structure and the plans
yeah,
for it,
yeah.
like and
Sorry, yeah,
Draco's
yeah.
involvement?
Um, we are going to ascend at some point, and this
Okay.
is what they're all worried about. And I'm not going to dwell. I'm not going to talk about the cabal. The cabal is bullshit.
Hmm.
Ultimately, in the big scheme of things, cabal
Okay.
is nothing.
They think they
Nothing.
have power, but they really don't.
They don't. They're going to be made obsolete when the changes come. They're just part of a strategy, a much bigger strategy.
Hmm.
The problem for them is they know how badly the human gene set has behaved. If you think we've destroyed planets, we've bloody well ruined whole solar systems. We are despicable. You don't get worse than that. So they're very concerned about how we're going to adjust to this new power when we shift to um, a different dimensional realm. And so yes, so they've muscled in, and they're going to be very much trying to condition us into their way of thinking.
Okay. That's
So
interesting, and I
that's
don't know if that's disturbing to me or not. Although, like, I mean, as me being a human being, as me being, one of these people living on the earth, I
yes,
personally, try to follow natural law and do unto others as I want them to do to me, which is try to be nice for the most part. Just
yeah,
because, I mean, obviously, I will return whatever I have to in order to make bad behavior stop if it is harming myself or my friends. But at the same time, like I just want to be peaceful and live my life. I don't want to have lots of problems. Like, and there's plenty of people that kind of do that. I know that there are like plenty of ones that don't. So for us, for the ones who want to actually try to behave quote unquote morally, how does that, how does it affect us? Like, I mean, aren't
uh,
we kind of like the more exemplary examples of the human race? If we're going to be talking about that, we're not trying to blow up planets or stars.
let's say in your room that a great big giant cockroach comes out and right in front of you. What are you going to do? You're going to step on it?
No, I'm probably not. I'm probably going to be like, what is this?
Yeah, but I mean, or you get a newspaper and swat it. You, I'm just trying to give you an example of human
Yes.
morality. We've got double standards with human morality. It's okay to kill off a bunch of ants because they've set up a nest, but what about those ants? They've got their lives to lead, and they're simply been killed because they've decided to exist in our space. So we've got these great high values when in fact we don't really live up to them
Hmm.
ourselves. Um, and I think that we've got to be a lot more honest with ourselves when we move into ascension.
I see now. I personally don't like to kill bugs or insects or anything if I can avoid it. I mean, obviously, if I'm riding my motorcycle down the road and something hits my face
Yes.
shield on my helmet, I can't help that. I'm sorry, but I accidentally hit you. I'm sorry, but what am I supposed to do about that? Like, how in the world do you obviously control your actions? Because I know Andrew Bartz has talked about this kind of a thing as well. Like, try not to harm anything you can't, but you can only go so far when you're have this sort of physical body and you're so and so big. You know what I mean?
The Draco believe in the balance of coexistence.
Mm.
And what that means is if something is a genuine threat and actually acts, isn't an existential threat, actually physically makes a move, then you have every right to attack in defense. That is the Draco philosophy. But until that threat attacks, you have no right.
Okay. I mean, I agree with that statement.
Everything,
That sounds like natural law to me.
everything is done by contract, but with them, the contract is at mind level. So you can't bullshit your way out. You can't say, "Oh no, I didn't want to do that," because they knew you did in your heart. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
That we can wheedle out of it. Our politicians say, "Oh no, I know I say I didn't mean that." There's no lying. There's no, because everything's linked to the heart,
Hmm.
or your deepest thoughts are out in the open.
Okay. I mean, if you're moving from the heart, if you're moving on that level, which is, entirely different than what most humans operate at for the most part,
Right.
you know, it seems to me that that makes absolute sense because if you're moving on that level, it's completely different, and you can't really BS your way out of it because it's just the way
Right.
it is. Like if you're intending to do something, that's one thing. You need to be honest about that, and then if
Yes.
you accidentally cause harm to someone else in the process of what you're doing, then you need to be prepared to find reconciliation for what it
Yes.
is you do, and hopefully that's not too severe because you don't want to actually
Yes.
harm someone too deeply.
Right. Right. They do have very big disputes, and they act. They have giant wars potentially.
Yes.
Although I think that at their level, most of these are done holographically.
Okay.
So when you get to that level, there's no need for anybody to actually. Uh, there was a movie about they played a game, and I can't remember what the name of the movie was, but essentially only one person ended up dying for the whole. Oh, that's right. And I watched it on. It's on one of the Blake Sevens. It's an old sci-fi show, years old, made in the UK. And there was one champion represented the entire planet system, and they would just go to war, and everybody would key into that mind. Incredible. This was a show that's written in the 1980s, I think it was, and
Huh.
they'd understood what was going on, and that's how the Draco, I think, would probably tackle that.
What is the name of that again?
It's called Blake's Seven.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna look that up because I'm very curious
It's
about
a famous series. I've got the whole lot, and I've watched through the whole series 10 times now, I think, and I still find little bits in there. I find it so intriguing. Who Different writers of each set, but there's so much in there that they must have known.
I'll put a link to that in the show. We are coming up on like the final 5 minutes.
That's what I thought.
Um,
Any
have
pressing
you?
question you want me to answer?
No, maybe not so pressing because we probably don't have time for anything that pressing. I did want to mention, like I've been watching. I watched for a while. I've watched over and over again, like Babylon 5, which was an American
Yes,
sci-fi show in the 1990s. It was
yes,
very well put together, kind of on that level. It was very interesting because what had happened was the giant races, or if you want to say the ancient ones who had helped create and guide everything, they got kind of unruly and were trying to wipe everything out. So the humans
yes,
stood up to them and kicked them out of their galaxy, basically. And they ended
yeah,
up making the only way they could do it was they kind of tried to make the other race, the bigger races, understand that it wasn't necessarily right for them to tell us what we could and could not do all the time, that we had to make our own way. And it was just a very interesting thing that kind of ties into all of this. I find all kinds of parallels, like you were saying about Blake 7, which I'm going to download soon. And I'm going to put a
I
link to that on the website too in the show notes, like everything we talked about here, because I found a interview with you mentioned this guy. I can't ever say his name now. Sixto Pax Wells. Yeah,
yes,
I'm
yes,
going to link an interview up with him so people can find him and the global freedom movement and um,
right.
that kind of stuff because I want to put that on there so people can find it, and Simon Parks as well, since you mentioned
Just,
him.
just, just very quickly, I think Blake Seven is probably the best, but Star Trek, Babylon 5, and all those other, even the one about the Stargate is, was it called Stargate?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, all very interesting, but they tend to humanize. They too much humanization of character sets.
Mm,
Whereas Blake Seven, they move outside that. They move outside the human mindset. They really start to experiment, which is why I like it.
yeah, that's very fascinating. One of the new ones that did kind of humanize a lot, but was very interesting, was The Expanse. But at any rate, we're out of time here. I had my special guest Steve Gilmore on. And his book is The Beauty of Existence Decoded. You can find links to his site, websites, and everything on my website. And Steve, very nice to have you on. I hope you have
Thank
a
you.
very good evening, and I'm sure we'll
You too.
have you back on the show at some point in the future. Thank
No
you very
problem.
much. And I hope everybody has a good night.
Listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
This is the people's war. It is our war. We are the fighters. Fight it then. Fight it with all that